So, the voting is over. About 10 days ago, we had the video about Blizzard beginning a poll, giving agency to the players to choose their favorite Season 1 and Season 2 dungeons to then make up and be included in the Mythic Plus Season 3 dungeon pool. This was quite interesting because, you know, giving space to players' opinions can sometimes often be very, very dangerous. I don't know if you remember the players unironically voting Grimrail Depot to be part of the Mythic Plus dungeon pool, and after that choice, Blizzard decided to give players another chance in choosing the dungeons. Now, we don't exactly know how or what will be the shape of the Mythic Plus pool next season. We can still presume it's going to be 8 dungeons, and we do know that in Season 3, next patch, we will have another new dungeon, which, as Blizzard has pointed out, will also go and be part of Mythic Plus. So we have one new dungeon, so either we will get 3 of these most voted dungeons, together with 4 old dungeons brought back up, or 4 of the more voted dungeons in this poll, and then 3 of the older dungeons being brought up in the Mythic Plus pool. So, in our older video, this was our prediction. This is what we thought based on a combination of dungeons being easy, or maybe dungeons being too hard, and then also possibly of the loot pool of those dungeons, because of course dungeons being in the Mythic Plus pool also means you will have the hero track version of those items at the end of the run, and even possibly the myth track version in your vault for these items. So starting from the absolutely least liked of the dungeons. This one is by far the most least liked, even between EU and NA voting. This one got practically a third of the votes of the second least liked dungeon. We're talking about City of Threads. So first of all, I want the names and the home addresses of all of the 601 players between EU and NA who actually unironically voted for this dungeon. These players have proven to be a danger to our community. They cannot be allowed to just roam freely and at large when they have proven to have such an unstable mental tendency, like for example enjoying City of Threads. City of Threads was way too long of a dungeon. City of Threads had pretty challenging and difficult bosses, especially the last 2 bosses. It also committed one of the biggest crimes of Mythic Plus dungeons, which is not having very large pools for far too long of the dungeon. Not allowing players to do Turbo Mega AoE is always quite the triggering element for players in whether or not they will be enjoying a Mythic Plus dungeon. It was a middling difficulty dungeon overall last season, and when it comes to high keys, it was one of the 2-3 hardest dungeons in terms of completion. If you simply go by the amount of times and the level of dungeons being completed last season, you will find that City of Threads will only have a handful of timed 19s. After these are all overtime, so 20 timed 19s last season. I believe only Grim Battle did worse, getting at 18 only, as well as something like the Stone Vault, having even fewer 19s completed. However, there is one thing that can always bail out a dungeon, which is its loot table. The dungeon might have been bad, but maybe, just maybe, because of the best in slot chase items in there, it could have been voted. Well, this makes it even worse, because the healer trinket in there was absolutely terrible. The non-healer trinkets, I haven't even read these before. I think these are made-up names that never actually existed in this dungeon. And even worse, the other possible chase items, like a good best in slot for stats, necklace or ring. Well, your necklace here has versatility, and your ring in here also has versatility. So by default, it both makes them garbage for the majority of the specs. An understandable last place for City of Threads. The second least voted dungeon. Here there was a bit more of a fight between the second and the third least voted, but this one won out in the end, which is the Stone Vault. Stone Vault, as we just looked at, was one of the harder dungeons to time at very high keys, and even if you look at the more general player base, last season it was the second hardest dungeon, right above Grim Battle. The dungeon itself was quite difficult. The bosses, in particular Skarmorak, even higher up at high key levels, was quite a challenging one. But more than that, the trash throughout the whole dungeon, either side of the wings, weren't particularly enjoyable. But again, maybe you can be bailed out by your loot table. Loot table was still quite poor. You had one middling to okay trinket used sometimes, the Skarmorak shards or your mastery proc trinket, as well as your necklace, which was mastery and haste, which is quite the best in slot one for quite a few specs. But clearly not enough to make Stonevault wanted by the player base. The other one that lost out in third to last place, slightly above the Stonevault, is one of the current dungeons, because we've just talked about two of the dungeons from Season 1. Now we are getting to a dungeon in Season 2, which is the Rookery. Now, funnily enough, talking about the Rookery right now, as of this week, it is the hardest dungeon to complete. You can also see it in the very high keys of this season. You can see the top keys right now. You can find Cleft, Motherlode, you can see the Priory being in here, you can see Workshop, you can see Brewery as well. You have to start scrolling down before you start to find the Rookery as well. So both at high keys and amongst the large player base, this has not been quite the easy dungeon, which is, possibly disappointing because players do enjoy 3 boss dungeons. 3 boss dungeons are supposed to be quite quick and fast and pacey. The trash in this dungeon is quite dangerous, both the first platform with the amount of cast you need to interrupt, as well as the birds with their AoE and even the single target focused damage they can do. The second part with the sacking and the charges, the void crashes of the ads. And then even the last part with the heal absorb and the big guy doing the ticking AoE damage is practically a different flavor of annoying trash on different phase of the dungeon. And then the lovely last boss, which can last upwards of like 6 minutes by itself at high key levels. Not even the loot could save this dungeon. You have the Entropic Scarduin Core, which is a cool trinket. It is a good trinket for most specs. Not really best in slot trinket for any, but still in the top 5 trinkets of some of the specs. And then a Crit Mastery Ring, which can also be quite good. However, that's just about all you have in the dungeon in terms of value for its loot. So the dungeon being hard, the loot not being amazing, it made it to the bottom, to the worst 3 of the dungeons being voted. Now the 4th least voted was a bit higher up than these 3, so there was a bit more contention with this dungeon, which is Dark Flame Cleft. Now, this one we mentioned being quite the difficult one to tell, because right now, for example, Dark Flame Cleft is the easiest dungeon, actually by quite a significant margin compared to the second best, which, spoiler, it's Priory, okay? So, Dark Flame Cleft, of course, does have the thing where, yes, technically they do have 4 different bosses, but it is still quite fast. It's practically on the pace of being a 3-boss dungeon because of how fast it feels like the trash goes in between bosses. As we have just seen also, not just from the overall keys, but also from the top keys, Dark Flame Cleft is also the most completed at top keys as well. I mean, look at when we often mentioned the lack of need of having, for example, top damage when it comes to your healers. You see this Dark Flame Cleft being completed with literally almost 6 minutes ahead of time on a +18. That's how little you need to go fast in this dungeon to time this key, even at high key level. As we said when we talked about this, the value in players' minds of Dark Flame Cleft might have been permanently damaged by the whole minigame, I guess, of the cart mechanic being very cool, also not allowing for many large pools, and just overall being an annoying mechanic to deal with, as well as the whole light mechanic on the last boss not also being very cool to go through. To make it worse, the loot in this dungeon is also quite bad. Similar to what we said about City of Threads, they have one necklace, not best in slot for practically anyone because it has crit and verse. And verse is not a very good thing to have on your gear for the majority of the specs. And then you have a ring. Well, the ring also has verse, haste and verse instead, which is not a very sought after combination of stats. The only thing that made players go in this dungeon for loot was the Blazicon Wax Trinket. And again, as we have seen already, a single trinket is not really enough to make up for the just general annoyance players had with this dungeon, the way this dungeon is laid out in terms of trash mobs in particular. The bosses are not necessarily bad by themselves, besides, of course, the last boss's mechanics, It was probably mostly just the trash mobs in there. The new, attempt at making some different mechanics in the dungeon between the cart and the light mechanic, it looks like it didn't go down too well within the player base. After Dark Flame Cleft, you have the last of the losers, if we assume the top 4 voted ones are going to win. So the last one of the losers, the 5th least voted dungeon. This one is relevant because there is a massive gap between this one and the top 4. Because the gap between the two is like 70% vote difference, which is very, very big. The 5th one in this case is Cinderbrew Midori. So, and with Midori being here, we can now pull back up our prediction we made 10 days ago, and turns out our prediction was 100% correct. Actually 110% correct, because we even left Midori for last as a doubt between Midori and possibly Priory being chosen as winners. At the moment, Midori is not one of the easier dungeons. It's right bang in the middle, even in high keys. As you see, the top run keys, for example, you don't see a single Midori at the moment. Our complaint with this dungeon was how full it was. How full of nameplates this is, how many ads and trash that spawns and just covers your screen this entire thing is. Both of the left side of the dungeon with the little blobs that spawn and the kegs being spawned by the goblins, and then the right side with the bees everywhere, as well as the very chaotic as well first room of the dungeon. Perhaps that is what annoyed players more, just the overall anxiety of having to constantly pull what feels like 20 mobs at once, no matter the pull you are doing. This is interesting because the loot in this dungeon can be considered good. Now, discounting whatever trash these two trinkets are, you do have one of the best in slot trinket for quite a few specs, or overall decent trinket for quite a few specs if you include for the fact that this seems usually for higher than it actually ends up doing with the whole keg spawning, etc, etc. It's still overall a good trinket. You still also have a very good ring in this dungeon with crit and mastery, and then one of the more sought after pieces, not just the weapons that can be looted in here, it's the necklace. Haste and Mastery, one of the more sought after combos for players. Haste and Mastery in terms of secondary stats, this is practically the reason 80% of players are still going in here to try to get this necklace. Even that was not enough to make Cinderbrew Midori in the top 4. Now we do have the top 4. The 4th one, which was a very hard fight with the 2nd and the 3rd in terms of votes. They were practically 5% of votes apart, these 3 dungeons. The 4th one is the Dawnbreaker. Now, last expansion, the Dawnbreaker was the easiest dungeons that we had in Season 1. Amongst the whole player base, it was by far the easiest dungeons. Amongst very high keys, it was the 3rd or so dungeons, because for top keys, Arakara and Necrotic Wake and even Mists actually were completed more at high key level than the Dawnbreaker was. But back again to one of the player base favorites, it was a 3-boss dungeon. It was quite fast, pulls were quite chunky, you were able to get quite a lot of Turbo Cleave AoE that is enjoyed by the players quite a lot in Mythic Plus. You did also have some pretty good loot in here. You had multiple players wanting to go in there. For example, you had crossbows for hunters, you had one-handed weapons for melee users, you also had the ones for rogues, you had one of the best in slot trinkets with the empowering crystal, just your generic stat stick with a secondary stat proc, and another one of the best in slot combinations sought after by players being the Devout Zealot's Ring, crit and haste. So the loot table was good, the bosses were nice, the trash was nice to go through, and the dungeon itself was quick. So it did make it in the top 4. Just barely above the Dawnbreaker, just by literally 80 votes, actually 79 votes, was Priory. So right this moment, Priory is the 2nd most likely to be completed dungeon in this season. Yes, again, going at high keys, you do have Darkened Cleft, you do have the Mother Lode being completed more often than the Priory is. You would have to scroll down quite a lot to actually start looking for Priory completions compared to the other ones at very high key level. But that's not why this was being voted very likely. Why this was being voted is, first of all, we are back to the 3 bosses. We are back to very chunky filled with mobs kind of pools. There's a lot of AoE to be had in the Priory. You do have a few wanted items in here. First of all, you had, well, it has been nerfed since, but it's still a tank trinket in the Tomes of Light Devotion, and then of course the Priory trinket, the Signet, that is being wanted by practically the majority of the 2-minute cooldown specs, because this is also not just for one specific primary stat, like some trinkets are, only for agility or only for strength or only for intellect. This one is for everyone. And then even the heal only one, the heal specific one for more damage, that is wanted a lot for Mythic Plus, of course. Those were really just the ones being sought after in terms of the loot table. And to quite a few players, myself included, the dungeon itself is just good. It's just a good dungeon, great feel and theme, like old school Scarlet Monastery kind of feels, except updated for modern audiences. Deserved winner is the Priory. Above the Priory, just like Priory was about 80 votes above Dawnbreaker, this one is about 80 votes above the Priory, which is Floodgate. Now, Blizzard, I'm sure, can consider it as a win, perhaps the bigger win this season, to have their newest introduced dungeon be the second favorite dungeon in this season. And this doesn't even have to do with the dungeon being easy, because yes, at the moment Floodgate is amongst the top 4 in terms of easy of completion, not really at high keys. You know, we have yet to see a single Floodgate in the top keys in here, for example. We are still scrolling down, we're now getting towards the top 200, still no Floodgate. There you go, first Floodgate. 202nd highest keys at 17, when the top keys are at plus 19 right now. So not even at high level. This is easy. It even breaks the tradition of enjoying 3 dungeon bosses more than the 4 dungeon bosses like Floodgate is. It's just a good dungeon. You know, none of these bosses are particularly just annoying to go through. Perhaps a release version of Swamp Face and release version of Gigazap were much more frustrating to deal with. Now they are way more manageable after the many changes given to these bosses, especially Swamp Face. Even the loot, even the loot is just okay. The bigger weapon you can find in there is for hunters and demon hunters, which aren't exactly, a lot of your playable classes. The healer trinket is an absolute tragedy. Yes, okay, fine. There is a best in slot trinket. There is a best in slot trinket, but it's mostly just for agility and strength users only, and that's it though. This one is a decent trinket for quite a few specs, but never, never quite the best in slot, and this trinket is garbage. So you don't have even like that many items that might want a lot of the player base to want Floodgate in, yet it was still voted as one of the best dungeons this season. And as mentioned, being the newest released one, it can be seen as quite a victory from Blizzard's own viewpoint. However, the winner, and this is where perhaps the controversy might be in a little bit more, is the fact that the number 1 had a slew of votes compared to the others, much like the gap between the 5th and the 4th place. This one is a similar gap of 1.8, 1.9k votes, which is Arakara. Arakara is our number 1, voted first by both NA and EU voters. So Arakara last season amongst the average player base wasn't exactly one of the easier dungeons. It definitely was for top players. For the very high keys last season, Arakara, together with Necrotic Wake and Mist, was the easier dungeon to complete at high level. So Arakara does fill some of the points that would make this enjoyable for the player base, which is, for example, having only 3 bosses and having the ability for quite some large pools, especially the whole part between the first and second boss. However, many players had something to say about the mechanics involved in dealing with the last boss, which is not something many players enjoyed. And then even then, at high keys, the first boss by itself starts to become more annoying, just surviving the AoE at certain levels and the health scaling on the adds spawning, filling up eventually the entire room with shit on the floor. It had some annoyances, let's just put it that way. However, what perhaps might have more value in this kind of dungeon is the fact that this is the dungeon with one of the smallest loot tables, also thanks to only having 3 bosses. And amongst this, small loot table, what you also have, of course, is Sackbrood, one of the Best in Slot trinkets last season. And that's kind of the fun thing, because pretty much everything else in this dungeon is trash. It is a dungeon that has no necklace, it is a dungeon that has no rings, it is a dungeon with only 3 weapons, and one of these is just a meme, extra effect kind of weapon, which is never very good. So really, it's just for Sackbrood at the end. So while we might not know whether or not 4 of the dungeons will be included next season or 3 of the dungeons, for sure Arakara will, because it was the number 1 of the voted dungeons. So now we have the full completed set of votes for this poll to determine the Season 3 dungeons, the winners. As we correctly predicted, are Arakara, Floodgate, Priory, and then whether or not we get to 3 or 4 dungeons, also the Dawnbreaker. And the gap is quite decisive. You can see the gap from the Dawnbreaker to the bottom 5 being quite large. This is what we have for today. At the end of this poll and at the conclusion of this voting, what has the community elected as its 4 favorite dungeons of these first 2 seasons of this expansion. So, of course, plenty of players will have something to say about these votes. Maybe someone was really in love with the Rookery or even with Darkflame Cleft. However, this was the will of the people. We have to be democratic here and just go ahead with what was chosen as the favorites. So, for today, though, on this Monday, it is now time to leave each other by starting, of course, to thank everyone for having watched the video, together with, of course, everyone else who has been supporting completely for free by liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, well, this could have been a 10-minute video, but, we got carried away a bit here.